So we go ahead to the scientific session. In this, we have the presenter in different fields: cardiology, internal medicine, gynec, endocrinology, rheumatology, oncology, neurology, preventive medicine, microbiology, and research. So each of these fields, we request the slides will be projected. We request the presenter in the order to start. For the first field, that is in the cardiology, I request the experts to join us on the panel. I request Dr. Krishnam Raju sir, Dr. M.K. Das sir, Dr. Vander, Dr. Srinath Reddy sir to join us on the panel for cardiology. We have 4 topics covered in this, and I hope the presenters are ready. So I will hand it on to the first presenter, that is Dr. Sujata, for CVD in females with COVID-19. Yes, madam.
Cardiovascular disease and COVID-19 issues in women. The association between diabetes and risk of death from COVID-19 is more in women than men. Incidence of myocardial injury is no different in men and women and is associated with increased mortality. Diagnosis of acute coronary syndromes in the setting of COVID-19 is further confounded in women and is fraught with delays in presentation and dilemmas in management, more so in women. Point of care antigen testing should be done before primary PCI in STEMI patients. A strategy of fibrinolysis in STEMI and COVID-19 in India is an acceptable alternative, especially in women, as non-obstructive coronary artery disease incidence is high.
Now I request the experts to give their opinion about these scientific statements.
Whatever we have seen in last many months, that is over 6 months, definitely the risk factors associated with women have actually told upon the course of the disease with COVID-19, and that has been established, and you have also commented. But what has been found in our observation, that myocardial injury has been found to be more as compared to the men, because of many factors, so what we have presumed. But this has been our observation, but the concrete data I cannot share right now because we are still analyzing. And another thing which has been found associated with the interventionalist finding, that definitely the non-obstructive or non-atherosclerotic disease has been found more, and there has been some sort of thrombogenic situation which has actually affected and they got manifested in the form of acute coronary syndrome, and they had to be taken care of with the different clot blasters or antiplatelet agents and all. So more or less, the statements that have been made are definitely very much in line with our observations, except that the myocardial injury due to the viral load, or maybe with the cytokine storm, which is again disputed now, that the cytokine storm is not the primary condition to cause the myocarditis and pericarditis, but definitely the myocardial injury has been found more in case of women. We do not know what is the cause and what is the background, but it is a common presumption that they have got more chance of developing the immunological disorders, and might be there is some association with this also.
Josna, can I make a comment?
Please, sir.
Okay. Something which now they are highlighting about virus producing the acute coronary syndromes is nothing really new, because in late 1960s and early 1970s from Brazil, Dr. Birch, he has produced and published a lot of articles on virus and coronary artery disease and acute MI human studies preceded by animal studies, and he had demonstrated the complement antigen antibody complexes in the coronary arteries. So this concept has been there for viruses, and they identified Coxsackie-B and many other viruses at that time. Subsequently, during the HIV epidemic also, they have demonstrated that. To just make a statement, all viruses, when they have viremia, they do invade the heart. So the COVID infection has been demonstrated in various countries from China to India, across Europe, United States, Italy, etc., that it can produce pericarditis, myocarditis, myopericarditis, and then coronary arteritis and coronary thrombi, and thrombi in the microcirculation of the coronaries, and thereby producing an acute myocardial infarct or acute coronary syndrome, or it can inflame the atherosclerotic plaque and rupture it and produce an acute coronary syndrome. And something which was published quite recently, I think I read it a couple of weeks back, was they started working on MRI of these people who have just recovered from the COVID, some of them symptomatic, some of them asymptomatic. And then they found, to their surprise, that almost 20% to 22% of them have late gadolinium enhancement of the myocardium on cardiac contrast MRI, indicating that there was myocardial scarring during the inflammation and infection stage. So now a big question is being asked. Should we do cardiac contrast MRI for all patients with, COVID positive patients? What are the outcomes like? What is the natural history? What will happen later on? Whether they will progress to something like a dilated cardiomyopathy, like we know that viral myocarditis, at least 25 to 30% of them end up with a dilated cardiomyopathy and subsequently land up with heart failure and sometimes even for cardiac transplant. Whether are we going that route? We don't really know at this point in time. Unless we have 3 seasons of COVID, we won't get answers to all these questions. But there are too many questions which are involved. I think I would invite other people if they have any ideas on that.
Shall we go to the next slide, Dr. Shiba?
So just a comment. We just brought out in the statements the issues relevant to women. In the review articles, we presented the entire other issues, sir, which you have mentioned.
Okay.
Shiba, you can proceed.
Right. I'll be presenting on venous thromboembolic events in COVID-19. Are women different? Less female predilection of venous thromboembolic events in COVID-19 pandemic is observed. Combined oral contraceptives and estrogen replacement therapy should be discouraged in COVID-19 positive women so as to prevent venous thromboembolic events. Thromboprophylaxis in standard doses is must in all COVID-19 positive hospitalized women, especially the ones with low bleeding risk, and it is to continue during a routine menstrual period. Thromboprophylaxis in intensified doses is recommended in COVID-19 positive hospitalized women with deranged hematological and clinical parameters of disease severity, again with low bleeding risk, and to continue in menstrual periods. COVID-19 positive women on home quarantine should receive thromboprophylaxis only when they are at high risk for venous thromboembolic events with a low bleeding risk again. Extended thromboprophylaxis post-discharge is recommended in COVID-19 positive women with high venous thromboembolic risk and a low bleeding risk.
Any comments from the experts?
I think what is happening is now people are looking at COVID not just as some viral infection. In fact, they may, in fact, would like to name it as a vasculitis, diffuse vascular disease, rather than just some kind of flu, COVID flu, which is very important, that designation. The reason being, almost all organs except probably the hair and nails have blood vessels, and the entry point of the virus are the ACE2 inhibitors. So endothelial invasion, that is how it happens. So what it means is, head to foot, any organ can be involved, including arteries and veins, that they have demonstrated in the autopsies in Italy and China. The thrombi in the veins, in the arteries, cerebral vessels, pulmonary arteries, coronary arteries. So, how many of these patients really have thrombi? How many of them embolize into the lungs? And how many of them end up with a mortality or a long-term lung parenchymal damage, which may result in a chronic pulmonary parenchymal insufficiency and chronic lung symptoms? Some of them might require a lung transplant. Already some centers have done single lung transplant, and some centers have done a double lung transplant. Some of them have, so all these are interlinked. So this is venous thromboembolism, venous thrombosis appears to be a very, very important component of this virus infection. That is also the reason why now it has been made near mandatory to give the low molecular weight heparin or heparin for all these patients. Those are my comments on that.
Right.
Yeah, I completely agree with Dr. Raju. And in fact, this is very, very important prophylactic measure as well for patients with the COVID infection, having the myocarditis and cardiac failure. In tune with the previous comment by Dr. Raju again on the aftermath effect of the COVID, it has been found recently that there are certain permanent changes that are happening in the heart in the form of scarring and all. These are being detected now. Now, what is more important related to the COVID scenario, the globe found that there was lesser incidence of MI, lesser incidence of admission in ICU, and all these things were happening during the time of COVID, whatever was the reason, whether lockdown or whatever is that. And that is also our own observation in India. But what has been published in Italy, they have shown that there has been increase in the death rate, sudden cardiac death rate at home itself. And there is a condition known as happy lung syndrome. It means there is hypoxemia which cannot be perceived by the patient. And in many of these patients, actually, possibly thromboembolic phenomenon were responsible, and they ignored their symptoms, and they ultimately could not reach even the hospital. Before that, the death occurred. Now, having that clue actually from the experience of the Italians while dealing with the lessening of the number of cases in CCUs and all during this last few months, the prophylactic use of heparin, which has been again found to have a common pathway with the involvement of the corona spike proteins. So they have been quite useful, and they are being used frequently for taking care of the disease as well as to prevent venous thromboembolic events. Over.
Just one more comment to add. We have some echo data from our own lab and other labs that these people, if you do an echocardiography, follow them up for a few weeks, what is happening is there is evidence of left ventricular systolic dysfunction, left ventricular diastolic dysfunction, And interestingly, right ventricular systolic dysfunction also, as they recover, right ventricle is recovering, left ventricular systolic function is recovering, but quite significant number of these people continue to have residual left ventricular diastolic dysfunction. So how this is going to pan out in the natural history of these people, we don't yet know.
Right. Thank you for the comments.
Yeah, we will go to the next slide, please.
A very good evening. Myself is Dr. Preta, and I'm going to present scientific statement for cardiovascular risk indicators in females with COVID-19 infection. First statement is low dose aspirin as prophylaxis and restriction should not be withdrawn in high-risk COVID-19 pregnant women in fear of increased risk of SARS-CoV-2 progression. Number 2, COVID-19 infection in pregnant women does not lead to a greater incidence of obstetric complications like preterm birth, preeclampsia, etc. Number 3, near-term pregnant or postpartum women with COVID-19 pneumonia while being high respiratory rate or dyspnea should be evaluated for new onset cardiomyopathy with the help of handheld point-of-care echocardiograms. Number 4, pregnant women with severe COVID-19 infection can develop a preeclampsia-like syndrome that might be distinguished from actual preeclampsia by additional estimation of biomarkers. Number 5, all pregnant women admitted with COVID-19 infection should be considered for antenatal venous thromboembolism prophylaxis, while those with mild COVID-19 infection and on home isolation should undergo VTE risk assessment to decide about venous thromboembolism prophylaxis.
I just have a couple of questions to Dr. Goel.
Yes, sir.
One is that, is there any difference between the woman delivering via cesarean section versus vaginal delivery? Are there any complications which are compared one against the other? That is question 1. Question 2, are there any studies of these neonatal babies born to COVID mothers? Question number 3 is there any data about a possibility of postpartum cardiomyopathy of these COVID mothers?
Okay, sir.
One thing I wanted to say about the first two questions, what you are asked is going to be presented by the gynecology people. They are talked about this vertical transmission and all those things. So about the third one, anyway, Goel is going to answer now.
Okay. So data on the peripartum cardiomyopathy in a pregnant woman who are infected with COVID-19 infection is only available in the form of case series. Like there was one paper which was from the EAMS. They have published only 2 case reports, and they those were the patients, those who had a rapid downhill course with the higher oxygen requirement, and then they tested for the any presence of the cardiomyopathy because they were having high troponin levels, and on echocardiograms they were found to have cardiomyopathy. But as such, because of the constraints regarding the diagnosis of the cardiomyopathy, like non-availability of echo machines for the COVID-19 patients, maybe, and because of the low suspicion of the cardiomyopathy in such a worsening respiratory distress or respiratory failure patients, we are not suspecting like new onset cardiomyopathy. So that's the reason they were not evaluated for the new onset cardiomyopathy. Maybe we are lagging behind from the diagnostic point of view in the form of cardiac enzymes or the lack of the echocardiograms. That is why we are not having a very good data for the cardiomyopathy in the postpartum women with the COVID-19 infection. That's why any postpartum or pregnant women who is having a rapid downhill course in the form of increased oxygen requirement or more of respiratory insufficiency, they should be evaluated for the new onset cardiomyopathy, because this, as you have already discussed, that we have a lot number of patients who are having myocardial scarring and myocarditis in this COVID era.
Do we have any data of these babies who are born to COVID mothers?
So that is there, vertical transmission. There are some case reports of the vertical transmission.
Cardiac involvement.
No, sir, there is no such data. I am not aware of any such kind of data.
Does anybody have any experience of that? I would be curious about it. Dr. Das?
From the data which
in the last 6 months, I have been referred all types of cases except the obstetric cases. Somehow or other, I didn't encounter a single encounter means I was never referred. So I have very, very poor information and poor kind of knowledge about this particular aspect. But what is surprising me, actually, a particular comment that is pregnant women with severe COVID-19 infection can develop a P-like syndrome that might be distinguished from actual P. That's a very very important statement that has been made here. And if it is like that, then we'll have to really focus on the biomarkers, especially the pro-BNP or BNP or those kind of markers will have to be much more emphasized in the pregnant women with COVID infection, because they might mimic the PE, and that is a very interesting finding. And definitely, I would definitely ask our colleagues to look into this particular aspect. Otherwise, I can't really share any of my information with the panelists nor with the participants.
Thank you, Dr. Das. May I ask Dr. Reddy?
These are only the guidelines. The evidence behind this has been mentioned in the individual articles which have been published in the book. These are only the guidelines, just the scientific guidelines. The evidence is all in the material, the original articles which has been attached in the book.
Okay. Does Professor KMK Reddy has any information on that? Because you are attached to a very large maternity hospital. I think he's not there.
Okay. Shall we go to the next one? That is about the drug and drug interactions in female with COVID-19 by Dr. Jyotsna, ma'am. Next slide, please.
Yes, madam. Now I'm going to talk about scientific statements on drug and drug disease interaction in females with COVID-19. Caution should be exercised when administering hydroxychloroquine to the breastfeeding woman. To avoid a strict monitoring in COVID-19 patients already on the warfarin, conversion of the warfarin to the direct oral anticoagulant is advised, except in pregnant or breastfeeding women, or in the mechanical heart valve patients, or severe maternal stenosis, or a triple positive antiphospholipid syndrome. Third one is tocilizumab. Usually, all immunosuppressive drugs are thought to be contraindicated during the pregnancy, but in the COVID-positive pregnant woman, the risk versus the benefit favors the drug usage of the tocilizumab, but not in the lactating woman. It can be used. It is essential for the lactating woman, then it is better to discontinue the breastfeeding. Fourth one is remdesivir and phosphodiesterase inhibitor. Both affect each other as both are MRP4 inhibitors. This statement was made because phosphodiesterase inhibitors are used much more frequently in the primary pulmonary hypertension, which is common in the females. Fifth, monitoring for the side effects of the flaviravir is required as the drug levels are increased in patients when given along with the estrogen receptor modulators. These estrogen receptor modulators are used usually for the breast cancer patients, but for them to give the flavipiravir, we have to think for a second time.
Any comments from the expert team?
I have a question to Dr. Jyotsna. Professor Jyotsna,
Yes, sir.
Do we have any particular drug which is absolutely contraindicated in these patients?
In COVID-19 patient, COVID-19 normal females?
Yeah, COVID-19 pregnant woman.
No, nothing Nothing is contraindicated. We can give every drug which we have tried during the COVID treatment.
Okay.
That's why I made a special statement on the tocilizumab, which is usually said that it can't be the given. But only thing, as we already know, that when the patient develops an LV dysfunction, as we already know, as a contraindication of the AC inhibitors and ARBs, and there is no studies on the neprilysin. So other than that, no other contraindications.
Steroids, for example?
Yes, can be given. And on the top,
Because
they said,
we know that steroids are teratogenic. So, I mean, is it acceptable to give it in the first trimester?
yes, sir. There are the studies in the different trimester about the steroids. The high dose of the steroids are indicated as a bolus, especially when the patient has an hypoxia and requiring a bolus therapy of the steroids, either dexamethasone or methylprednisolone. It is indicated for the safety of the mother. So there is no question of thinking about the teratogenicity at that level. But tapering of the steroids usually takes a longer time in a normal COVID-19 patients for the to taper it. But here, as the improvement then occurs, we have to taper it faster. So it is every stage of the pregnancy, it is indicated for the safety of the mother.
Then what about the antiviral agents which are being used now more and more frequently? For example, remdesivir. What is its effect on the fetus?
Yes, sir. They are not yet reported any side effects for the remdesivir. So they recommend to give the remdesivir. Only when the patient is on phosphodiesterase inhibitors, either it can increase or decrease the remdesivir effect. So also the phosphodiesterase effect may increase or decrease. So exaggeration of the PAH complications or exaggeration of the COVID can happen when you combine these two.
You know that many of these patients, once they drop their oxygen levels, they are on BiPAP or CPAP or invasive ventilation or nasal prongs, sometimes high flow oxygens. Now the question is, we know that there is something called oxygen toxicity for the baby. So, I mean, is there any mention in the literature which you are aware or anybody is aware of oxygen toxicity to the fetus?
No, sir, I'm not. Actually, I searched for the pregnant ladies who has the problems of the COVID. What was the end results? They are talking about the miscarriages and early delivery, which is also is not proved to be the higher in the case of the COVID pregnant women, and complications during that unless the patient has a hypoxia. So I could not get in the any literature search about a delivered babies having the problem. I specifically saw for it.
Are there any recommendations about lactation?
In the lactation, there are the many restrictions are there. Actually, the tocilizumab is better not to give during the lactating females. Up to the extent they say that if it is essential to give the tocilizumab to a pregnant lady, please discontinue the feeding. And remdesivir, there is no contraindication in the lactating women.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Just one comment regarding the hydroxychloroquine, because okay, you have mentioned about the caution should be exercised, but so for the hydroxychloroquine in COVID is concerned, actually there are two schools of thoughts. One from the eastern part of the globe and the other from the western part of the globe, and western part of the globe had the experience of more mortality with hydroxychloroquine use. They have cited more on the drug-to-drug interactions, especially when hydroxychloroquine is used in combination with some antibiotics like macrolide and all, and antifungal agents, and amiodarone types 1 and types 3 antiarrhythmic drugs. So they were having more mortality. But so far, Indian experience is concerned, many people say that especially the ICMR has recommended that it should be used in as a prophylactic one, when the health workers are working with the COVID patients. So they are recommending, and also in some of the states they have recommended in very mild patients. So these are some of the points which are very important, which should be taken into account.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Das, as we know, there are pharmacogenetic differences, interracial, international differences. Why they happen, they may have a genetic basis, or also the frequent usages of some of these drugs in malaria, high malaria endemic areas like Africa, Asia. As you know, the greatest killer in the globe, number one killer is malaria. So these drugs are very frequently used in South America, Africa, and Asian countries. Maybe we are resistant to its bad effects. That is one comment I can make. The other comment is there is something what is called as a chloroquine cardiomyopathy. We have seen a couple of them. They have a very characteristic inclusion bodies in the myocardium. This produces a dilated cardiomyopathy. These curved antibodies are in the mitochondria, which are absolutely classical, and they are not seen in any other type of cardiomyopathy. So they are pathognomonic of chloroquine cardiomyopathy. Why I am mentioning that is, it seems that chloroquine can directly damage the myocardium.
Yeah, completely agree.
The points are well taken. And we will end this session and go to the next session on internal medicine. Thanks, Dr. Krishnam Raju sir, Dr. M.K. Das sir, and thanks to the presenters. The internal medicine team, I request Dr. Vital Gupta, Dr.
Thank you.
Satyanarayan sir, Dr. Manjari
Thank you, sir.
Srivastava sir to be on the panel.
Thanks everyone. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Vandana Midha.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I will be putting the scientific statements of the clinical presentation in COVID-19. Okay, statement 1. All COVID-19 patients with moderate to severe lung involvement shall be closely followed and evaluated for post-COVID pulmonary complications with pulmonary function test and CT chest to assess for onset pulmonary fibrosis so as to target for timely antifibrotic therapies. This is the first statement. Okay, the slide. Going on to statement 2, patients presenting with only GI symptoms like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea shall be evaluated for COVID-19 infection even in the absence of respiratory symptoms during this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Statement 3, okay, males with an androgenic pattern of baldness are more susceptible to COVID-19 infection, and that too with higher severity.
May I have
Any
the
comments
comments
from the panel?
I think these three, and Dr. Raju from NIMS, I think all three statements have some, they hold good, but I think it's a little premature to talk about all these complications. These are only small studies by different centers. Now ICMR has got a national data registry for COVID, where almost 17 centers from all over India with satellite centers have started.
Identified an enzyme, and these are based on 2 studies only. This needs to be looked into further, but this is a study based on a large number of people from UK. As far as GI symptoms are concerned, there is a meta-analysis as well as some systemic analysis, which involves around 29 studies and which have reported that the
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, ma'am. These are all studies from other countries. All three statements hold good, no doubt about it. But for our own data, we have got a national data registry by ICMR with 17 centers, with satellite centers are going to collect data to know the distribution, clinical presentation, management, and the response to comment about Indian data in the future.
I agree with you, sir.
And about antifibrotic. There were presentations by our own radiologists, and this fibrosis is going to last for some time. We are starting our antifibrotic therapies on discharge so that we don't have problems subsequently. And GI symptoms are also very common, and COVID could present with any symptom.
Yes, sir. I totally agree with you.
Can we go to the next presentation? That is Management of COVID-19 by Dr. Mary John.
You want me to read the slides on her behalf, Dr. Lalita?
Sure, if she's not available, we can.
I think there are some internet issues at her corner, so maybe I'll just read out the slide on her behalf. So I'm reading on behalf of Dr. Mary John, Management of COVID, Evidence and Experience. Elevated or rising D-dimer levels along with worsening hypoxemia may indicate ongoing thrombosis and need to be treated with prophylactic or therapeutic doses of anticoagulants. In patients hospitalized with COVID-19 with hypoxemia, glucocorticoids are to be used, dexamethasone 6 milligrams IV or oral for 10 days or till discharge. Consider the use of remdesivir for 5 days in patients with moderate COVID disease who are not on mechanical ventilation, and consider tocilizumab. However, this is in the context of a clinical trial.
Raju sir, with a lot of experience in NIMS, can you comment on that?
I think these statements are a little obsolete, ma'am, because these are saying that trial in a clinical trial or some of these things, we use this routinely because with our experience, we have seen that in hospitalized patients with hypoxia, and we check out on the D-dimers, CRP, ferritin levels, and immediately go in for steroids, remdesivir, and tocilizumab. So this has come into regular practice now. I think these statements are a little old, and even some of the cases we have given twice tocilizumab, though there's no evidence-based study saying that you can use it twice, but we have given it out of desperation. And the results are good. Our mortality rate is very low, and our mortality rate is more because of the comorbidities rather than COVID-19.
Dr. Raju, I think what you are saying and the statements are the same. In the patient hospitalized with the COVID-19 with the hypoxia, we are saying that the glucocorticoids has to be given. That's what you are also saying it. And only the controversy is about to consider the tocilizumab in a context of the clinical trial.
Yes.
Because tocilizumab, I know that Nizam is showing a very good result, and we are running a trial on that. But the literature, this is a major point of here for the scientific statements, is the literature evidence.
Yeah,
So literature evidence.
I totally agree, ma'am. I'm totally agree. But my statements are with our experience.
Yeah, that's what. So for us to give a scientific statement, we should have a published evidence to say that yes, it is recommended. So as you said, yes, our experience, I also know it because we are attending these things. So I think still it is relevant. Whatever words you have said is the same thing is told here, except for the tocilizumab, which is not come as a guidelines at present, but we are showing a good results. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
The evidence in COVID is changing with experience. So I think the future guidelines might include this once the trials confirm it, and NIMS may play a major role for that.
Yeah, I
Thank
totally
you,
agree
Dr.
with you, ma'am.
Satyanarayana,
Anything that has to come out in print has to have evidence.
Yes, sir. Thanks a lot. We go to the next session on gynec obstetrics. Can we have Dr. Alpesh Gandhi and Dr. Padmaja ma'am on the panel? We have 4 presentations in it. Dr. Amruta to begin with the presentation.
A very good evening to everyone. I'm Dr. Amruta, and I'm going to present the scientific statement on management of gynecological patients during the pandemic. My first statement is patients with heavy menstrual bleeding should be managed medically when feasible, unless the patient presents with acute or intractable bleeding, severe to cause anemia requiring blood transfusion. My second statement is patients with postmenopausal bleeding and a low risk of malignancy with normal ultrasound can be offered reassurance and advised to report persistent or recurrent symptoms, as the risk of malignancy in such kind of patients is relatively low.
Next slide is also is madam's. I think you can go ahead.
Okay, madam. Can I have the next slide? Thank you.
Yes.
These are the scientific statements on gynecological endoscopic surgery during the COVID pandemic. My first statement is preoperative clinical screening for symptoms of COVID-19 and nasopharyngeal swab for RT-PCR are recommended. However, CT chest of and the above investigations can be performed in concomitance to increase the further sensitivity of diagnosing COVID-19 infection. My second statement is the theoretical risk of dispersion of COVID-19 by the carbon dioxide used to create pneumoperitoneum from the patient's abdomen to the outside environmental air must be considered, and effective systems should be in place for proper smoke evacuation and filtration. My third statement is that gynecological endoscopic surgery can be safe when performed cautiously with the usage of personal protective equipment. However, alternative routes of surgery like laparotomy and vaginal surgery can be considered in appropriate situation, especially when resources are limited. Thank you.
Any comments from the panel?
Hello, I'm Dr. Padmaja. I agree with most of the statements made by Dr. Amrita. As time is passing, people have become more older and they have started doing laparoscopy also in a limited way, and postmenopausal bleeding also. As time is progressing, people have started agreeing to get investigated. In the beginning of the pandemic, patients also were not willing, doctors also were not willing for invasive procedures. Now the scenario is changing a bit. As it is an ongoing pandemic, I think the last word cannot be said. The more updates we get, we may have to alter our thinking process. Otherwise, I agree with most of the statements made by Dr. Amrita.
Madam, one question regarding the endoscopic surgery. You said it can be safely performed. I mean, do you require a separate setup for these patients, or the same setup can be used for COVID positive patients?
Madam, the same setup can be used, but you can't interchange the setup. It's ideal not to use the same setup for COVID and non-COVID. If you have a theater that you're operating separately for COVID patients, then the sterilization of instruments is all the same.
Right. We go to the next presentation.
Okay. This scientific statement is on COVID-19 infections in pregnancy. Now, 1. COVID-19 infection during pregnancy may produce more severe symptoms. 2. Pregnant women with high risk category require more attention as these women are at higher risk of developing severe illness. 3. All pregnant women should be screened for signs and symptoms of COVID-19 infection. 4. There is a possibility of vertical transmission from mother to fetus in utero or during childbirth. 5th, mode of birth should not be influenced by the presence of COVID-19 unless the women's respiratory condition demands urgent delivery. Number 6, universal testing of pregnant women of COVID-19 at admission to labor suite is required.
I have a practical question for the gynecologists who are there on the panel. Are you doing a rapid antigen test, or is it the RT-PCR for COVID when you are admitting the patient for labor? Any gynecologists on the panel, on the panel to answer that?
So before the expected date, 1 week, all pregnant women have been advised to go and get an RT-PCR test done. Now it is available in many places. If they come as an emergency, we are going for the rapid antigen test because time consumed will be more to get the RT-PCR. Then HRCT is also done if they are presenting with respiratory symptoms. They are being taken up for the
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Suman Puri on the next presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Can I have my slide, please?
Yes,
I
ma'am.
will be giving the scientific statements regarding the infertility treatment in the COVID pandemic. Infertility and IVF services should be reopened, especially for patients with decreased ovarian reserve and those requiring fertility preservation, such as the cancer survivors, after proper counseling and individualizing a case. The COVID testing has to be done on the second day of the cycle before starting controlled ovarian hyperstimulation, and it should be repeated 24 hours prior to giving the ovarian trigger. The husband also needs to be tested at least once during the cycle, and COVID testing has to be done for all patients undergoing infertility-related procedures such as hysterosalpingography, laparoscopy, hysteroscopy, ovulation inductions, and intrauterine inseminations.
Any comments from the panel for that?
As of date, there are no differences. All these statements, most of us agree with these statements.
Okay. So that comes to the end of the Gynox panel, and we next go to the next panel on endocrinology. Any comments? Okay. Dr. Gagan Priya to present on endocrinology, and I request Dr. Rakesh Sahai sir, Dr. P.V. Rao, and Dr. Kalras to be on the panel, please.
Hi. So for the endocrine segment, our scientific statement included that insulin should be the mainstay for hyperglycemia treatment in women who develop moderate to severe COVID-19 infection. Pregnant women should continue to receive optimal diabetes care during the pandemic with advice on nutrition, self-monitoring of blood glucose, and insulin therapy where required. To minimize the chances of inadvertent exposure to infection during clinic visits, telemedicine services should be considered for all pregnant women with diabetes for remote monitoring of glycemic control and insulin dose titration. The third recommendation was that for routine screening of pregnant women for gestational diabetes mellitus, since OGT is difficult to perform in current scenario, alternative screening strategies like fasting plasma glucose and glycosylated hemoglobin should be considered in place of OGTT. This would minimize the chance of exposure to pregnant women to the COVID-19 infection. The fourth recommendation was for adrenal insufficiency. That is, women with adrenal insufficiency who develop COVID-19 infection need to increase the dose of glucocorticoids to stress doses. That is, hydrocortisone 20 milligrams every 6 hourly orally, or in case of severe infection or clinical deterioration, intravenous glucocorticoids 50 mg every 6 hours, or as a continuous hydrocort infusion should be administered. So this was basically the details that were relevant to women in particular, since we were drafting scientific statements for women.
Ma'am, one question, de novo diabetes is being detected during this infection. Would you like to comment anything on that?
Yes, but it's not like unique to women. We have in the review article added that, for all COVID infection, monitoring of blood glucose is required, because we are having a lot of cases of not just stress hyperglycemia, but what looks as persistent de novo diabetes.
Thank you, ma'am. We go to the next session on rheumatology.
The experts may be willing to tell something on endocrinology.
Could I just make one point? Very well presented and very good statements made. But as was discussed, maybe the 2 points that can be added are that there's a need for follow post treatment for the glycemic management, which we're seeing that even people who women who had women or men, it's the same for both, but it needs to be mentioned that they need glycemic monitoring to be followed after recovery from COVID infection also. And the second point that I was thinking is that and monitoring for new onset of diabetes after COVID infection. And the second point I was thinking that we have mentioned about the screening for gestational diabetes. Probably we can also add a point that it can be done by home monitoring by using a glucometer. That can also be used for diagnosis of gestational diabetes. We don't have to ask the woman to come go to the lab for a glycosylated hemoglobin or go to the lab for a fasting plasma glucose, but it will be done with a glucometer with a capillary blood glucose measurement, which has been validated in studies. There are some studies which have shown that these are also valid enough to make a diagnosis of gestational diabetes. So maybe these 2 points can be added subsequently.
Yeah. Professor Sai, I was just going through your other paper also on the DIPSI criteria. Maybe we can add a sentence to that effect where the woman can take the glucose load at home and we can do a monitoring later.
Just wondering, can be done if she comes 2 hours.
Yes.
How long we have to monitor for the blood sugar in a non-diabetic patient after the COVID recovery?
Well, we don't have good data because still the epidemic is evolving, pandemic is evolving. So I think we can just mention, say, maybe about for 6 to 12 weeks, 8 to 12 weeks, we can mention.
Normally, we would do an OGTT after 6 to 8 weeks, but here we can charge them to monitor because OGTT we would want to avoid in this scenario.
Can we go to the next session on rheumatology?
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for your comments and thanks for your advice, ma'am. The next session is on rheumatology by Dr. Benzita Pinto.
Good evening.
Please can you tell about the experts?
I request Dr. U.R.K. Rao, sir, Dr. Sapan Pandya, and Dr. Alakendu Ghosh to be on the panel, please.
Okay, so there is not so much data of COVID-19 in rheumatic diseases, so the risk seems to be only slightly higher than that of the general population or similar to the general population. So there is one study which showed an elevated risk in non-SLE systemic autoimmune disease, but the risk was similar in patients with rheumatoid arthritis and other diseases. So when they looked at the severity of COVID-19, there seems to be a higher risk of ICU admission and respiratory failure in patients with rheumatic disease compared with non-rheumatic disease controls. However, the mortality was same compared to non-RD patients. There is no evidence to say that any particular drug is associated with this increased risk, except for higher doses of steroids, which are associated with increased risk. But all other drugs are, there is no great evidence to say that biologic DMARDs or targeted synthetic DMARDs are associated with increased risk of COVID-19. In a patient with rheumatic disease who has COVID-19 infection, biologic DMARDs and targeted synthetic DMARD, except tocilizumab, may be interrupted if required. Steroids should not be discontinued in patients with COVID-19 infection.
Yeah.
Any insights from the panel?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Alakendu Ghosh.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Benjita had a nice presentation. I think the only issue which we are concerned as a rheumatologist and very excited in reference to hydroxychloroquine. Lot of contradictory data are coming up, and we have the huge experience of using hydroxychloroquine in our lupus patient. And that's an amazingly safe drug, and that can easily be continued throughout the pregnancy, breastfeeding, and absolutely no issues. And we usually use not more than 5 milligrams per kg per day. And in COVID, pre-exposure prophylaxis and post-exposure prophylaxis and during treatment. So it's a 3 different scenarios and absolutely different status. Like pre-exposure prophylaxis, initially ICMR is giving the data to continue up to 7 weeks. But now we can understand that we are being exposed regularly. So people are confused how long to continue to titrate. Post-exposure, possibly double RCTs are there, not beneficial. And during treatment, yes, of course, along with these combination treatments with other medication, hydroxychloroquine can be used. And hydroxychloroquine in reference to cardiac arrhythmias, as we are experiencing in lupus precisely, because all patients of lupus are getting hydroxychloroquine from day one. And we cannot remember any of our patients having arrhythmia or cardiac adverse events in reference to hydroxychloroquine. So this is one of the very great safe drugs. And as Benjita told, that in musculoskeletal autoimmune rheumatological disorders, along with the COVID, no significant manipulation in reference to therapy, pharmacotherapy is required.
It is surprising to see that, sir, because we expect some immunosuppression in them and we expect them to be at increased risk. But your data says that there is no evidence that there is an increased risk of COVID.
Yeah, that's right.
Ma'am,
second thing, sir, in your experience, these SLE patients, are they less at risk, though the statement says that the risk is no different?
Yeah, in SLE patients are using systemic from hydroxychloroquine from day one. And we are collecting data throughout the country through our Indian Rheumatology Association COVID database. So we are getting gradually from different centers, we are collating those data. So it's not very significantly increase in reference to autoimmune rheumatic disease. And we don't know whether because of hydroxychloroquine, majority of the patients are taking, that is the protective effect, possibly not. And majority of the patients are not coming out from home. And some of the people who are coming, they are taking the usual precaution. So this is the axis which are being manipulated and being balanced in reference to COVID exposure.
Ma'am, I just have one point to add. Actually, in a lot of studies, in one Italian study, they have shown that rheumatic disease patients exert more diligence compared to the general population. So that is one of the factors that has been attributed in the registry from Italy. It said that maybe that is one of the reasons why the prevalence is the same. Secondly, we don't, as of now, have much data. So only when data comes in, we will be really able to say. So that's all, ma'am. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Ghosh. Dr. Pinto, thanks a lot. Should we go to the next session on oncology? I request Dr. Monica and Dr. Vinita Reddy to be present, and the experts, Dr. Sanjeeva Kumari and Dr. Kaushik Bhattacharya.
Yeah, good evening. I'm Dr. Vinita. I would be presenting scientific statements on gynecological cancers during the COVID-19 pandemic. Cervical cancer is an aggressive malignancy, but a good potential for cure in localized stages and should be treated without delay even during the pandemic. Scientific statement 2. Management of women with endometrial cancers during the COVID-19 pandemic should be based on risk stratification. Scientific statement 3. Management of patients with epithelial ovarian cancers should be individualized during the COVID-19 pandemic based on risk versus benefit. Thank you.
Yeah, the scientific statements made by Dr. Vinita Reddy are correct, appropriate, and basically, cancer malignancy, we cannot wait for the treatment. So in early stages, when during March and April, we used to postpone. Right now, we are not postponing the treatment. Once the patient gets infected, until the patient is treated for COVID, so we stop the treatment and then resume the treatment. So the scientific statement made by Vinita Reddy is appropriate.
Does the treatment for COVID differ, or any drug interactions are there with in these patients?
For gynecological cancers, as far as I know, so no interactions. Because usually when the patient is COVID positive, we are postponing the chemotherapy, even the radiotherapy, unless the patient is having serious complaints like spinal cord obstruction or brain secondaries, where we treat the patient. We cannot afford to have a separate machine to treat with radiotherapy to treat the COVID patients. We just give the last slot to the patient for radiotherapy and then sanitize the treatment room, and then take up the other cases. So in serious complications, in serious conditions, emergency conditions like spinal cord obstruction, brain secondaries, and the emergency conditions also, which can be managed by medical management, like brain secondaries, we can manage with steroids and all for a few days. So those things can be managed with medical management. Unless only radiotherapy has to be given, then we give the last slot.
The next presentation on COVID-19 infections and breast cancer.
Yeah, hi, this is Dr. Monica Irukula, and I'll be talking on care of women with breast cancer during the COVID-19 pandemic. So for suspected cases of breast cancer, the diagnostic and staging workup should proceed without delay. And this is especially important in our country where patients present with advanced stages and there is a delay presenting to the treatment facility. So as soon as a patient presents, we should proceed without delay, ideally, and not postpone any diagnostic workup and the treatment planning. Surgical decisions in patients with breast cancer should be based on disease biology and risk stratification. So patients with a low risk disease or with pre-invasive disease In those patients, surgical decisions or surgeries can be postponed, but patients with high risk disease and especially patients who've completed neoadjuvant chemotherapy should proceed with the planned surgery without delay. Adjuvant post-operative radiation should not be delayed for patients with high risk features again, because adjuvant radiation has been shown to be associated with improved local control and improved overall survival. And decisions regarding systemic therapies should be highly individualized. As far as possible, we should avoid dose-dense, highly immunosuppressive regimens and tune the regimen such that the visits to the treatment center for the patient are minimized. And some drugs such as immune checkpoint inhibitors or mTOR inhibitors, which are highly immunosuppressive, can be avoided if the pandemic situation is bad. And in case the patient is diagnosed with COVID, mostly the oncology treatment is postponed till the patient recovers, unless there are very severe or pressing symptoms which need to be addressed immediately. Thank you.
The scientific statement presented by Dr. Monica for the care of women with breast cancer during the COVID pandemic are appropriate. So actually in the cardiology session, so there was a point, this favipiravir and tamoxifen. This so they were having that, there will be increased drug levels. But as far as we know, but tamoxifen can be stopped for few days. Nothing will happen. As such, as Monica was telling, so when the patient is COVID positive, we can stop all the drugs for a while. Once the patient is free of COVID infection, then we can restart either hormonal therapy or chemotherapy or radiotherapy, unless there is a impending complications.
Any more comments?
Good evening, Dr. Lalita.
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes.
I'm Dr. Pooja Tandon, and I would like to actually answer a few of the queries which I was unable to answer before regarding the COVID infections in pregnant women.
Yes, ma'am.
So one question was asked regarding the mode of the delivery, whether C-section, women undergoing C-section have more morbidity as compared to vaginal delivery. So there is a Spanish study which has been published in JAMA, which says that women undergoing vaginal delivery have less morbidity as compared to those who undergo C-section. And the second query was regarding the neonates who have been born to COVID-19 pregnant women, whether they are more prone to have infections. What has been found is that some of the neonates have developed COVID-19 infections in immediate postnatal period, but most of these neonates have done well. There are very few reports of neonates getting sick after having COVID-19 infection. So earlier I could not comment, so I have logged in again, and I wanted to make these comments regarding pregnancy and COVID-19 infections.
Thanks a lot, ma'am, for your expert comments. And we come to the end of the oncology session, and thank you, Dr. Sanjeeva Kumari, madam, and Dr. Monica and Dr. Vinita, ma'am. We go to the next session on neurology. I request Dr. JMK Murthy, sir, and Dr. Pramod Paul, sir, to be on the panel, and Dr. Astha Kapila to present it.
Yeah, very good evening to everyone. I hope I'm audible. So I'll be so I'm Dr. Astha, and I'll be presenting scientific statements on COVID infections and neurological disorders in women. So starting with the statements, thrombolytic therapy is probably indicated in otherwise eligible COVID-19 suspect or positive women with acute ischemic stroke who are menstruating and who do not have a history of menorrhagia, after ruling out any additional contraindications like coagulopathy. Thrombolytic therapy for moderate and severe stroke may be considered in pregnant COVID-19 suspect or positive patients when the likely benefits of stroke treatment outweigh the anticipated bleeding risks, usually the uterine bleeding. SARS-CoV-2 infection may further increase the risk of developing cerebral venous sinus thrombosis in women consuming oral contraceptive pills. Thank you.
Any comments from the expert panel?
Most of these statements are correct, but I would like to say one thing. The patient with COVID infection are likely to be predisposed to cerebral venous thrombosis because they have increased levels of D-dimer. But the number of cases reported, as far as I'm not aware, maybe 1 or 2 cases, but that's one. Coming to thrombolytic therapy, the statements are correct. We can't deny because the only proven treatment for acute ischemic stroke is thrombolytic therapy given in 4.5 hours time. And thrombectomy is also not contraindicated because the evidence so far suggests these patients, COVID-19 infection patients, have most often they have a stroke, what we call large vessel artery occlusive strokes. And in these patients, most of them, the best option of treatment is thrombectomy if they come in time, that is 6 hours. So there are no contraindications, but there are no much data on cerebral venous thrombosis and consuming oral contraceptive in COVID infection.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And one more thing, sir. We have mentioned all these points in our basic chapter, gender and gender issues in COVID in neurology, sir. There's lack of data regarding these statements.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Astha Kapila. If no more comments, we'll go to the next session on preventive medicine. May we have Professor Padmaja and Professor Kesala Madam to be on the panel? And
Dr. Lalita, if you would allow me to interrupt you for just a minute. Actually, I think some things happen for a reason. Today, when I was delivering my vote of thanks, I missed one of my very dear friends. Actually, more than a friend, she's my right hand. And Dr. Mohanjeet Kaur. I remember that when we started working on guidelines, I called her and it was typical COVID season and everyone was wearing a mask and she was the one who came across and sat with me in my OPD and we discussed how we can actually manage about the guidelines and she took my pick. And I don't know why God planned it that when I was speaking, I think you intend to forget yourself in most of the things. So maybe that must have been the reason. Thank you, Dr. Mohanjeet, for your immense contribution as always. I could never have comprehended WCC 2020 also, which we had in Ludhiana without your help. So thank you so much and apologies for having missed something which I could never have even imagined. Thank you so much. Sorry, Dr. Lalita, I took a minute from your scientific session, but I thought it was very important. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, please. Dr. Anurag Chaudhary.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So from preventive medicine side, we have the recommendations or scientific statement for the safety of healthcare workers as well as for female patients who are quarantined. So the first one is for the healthcare workers, the wearing of PPE kits for long duration, 8 hours or more, in female healthcare worker leads to problems in menstrual health and hygiene, and hence duty hours should be reduced to 4 hours while simultaneously ensuring menstrual health and hygiene in wash facilities. So in continuation with this, the material for maintaining menstrual health and hygiene should be available in sufficient quantities for female healthcare workers during menstruation. And this should be provided by the health department or a facility to avoid women bleeding into their PPE suit during menstruation or to avoid unwilling suppression of menstruation with oral contraceptive pills. The second one is for the female patients. The menstrual hygiene material and painkiller should be provided to female patients quarantined in healthcare facilities or COVID-19 designated centers, and training of caretakers and support for water sanitation and hygiene. Regarding the prophylaxis, HCQ prophylaxis should be recommended to all healthcare workers working in COVID and non-COVID healthcare settings for 8 weeks and more. And HCQ prophylaxis in female healthcare workers during pregnancy should be continued. Relative infant dose must be the critical parameter and should be calculated.
if HCQ prophylaxis needs to be given in lactating healthcare worker for post-exposure prophylaxis. Thank you.
Can you request Alita to introduce the experts of this session?
We have Professor Padmaja ma'am and Professor Priscilla ma'am on the panel for this. Dr. Priscilla ma'am?
I have a point. Yeah, most of them are based on good studies. They're all correct. But in our practical scenario, PPE kits cannot be worn more than 2 hours in general also. So it becomes a tougher situation for a female menstruating and the other issues specific to females. So maybe that we can work on it, and some papers come out and good studies come out, we can apply. And then, so these are the things which are specific as far as PPE concerned. And one more thing, I think what we have missed out here is the guidelines from Ministry of Health. From time to time, past 6 months, the Ministry of Health has taken a lot of input from all the experts in the microbiology department and from the field they have taken, and they have come out with a lot of advisories and the guidelines. So one of the guidelines, of course, it doesn't mention here, but earlier during the pregnancy screening and all, I thought I made a point. The RAT testing, the rapid antigen testing, is the first testing to be done wherever required. If it is positive in a symptomatic case or a contact history, we don't have to further go with RT-PCR. This is the advisory from Ministry of Health I'm referring to. If it is negative, then we have to go for RT-PCR testing. So all the more it becomes pertinent and important that during pregnancy or at the labor time or the cesarean section, when the patient has come and we think we need to test her for COVID either due to symptoms or contact history.
Okay, Dr. Priscilla, thank you very much for your valuable inputs. But regarding the COVID, the screening for, the routine testing for COVID in healthcare workers. So could you please give us your inputs regarding the, whether it should be done on a monthly basis for healthcare
a weekly basis.
Pardon, ma'am?
It should be done on weekly basis. RAT testing is sufficient. Rapid antigen testing.
It should be. Actually, this point has not been included in the scientific guidelines for the healthcare workers. So I think we need to include that.
Yeah, it will come. Subsequently, it will come.
Actually, ma'am, we were discussing the routine testing of for COVID in healthcare workers working in COVID and non-COVID areas, actually.
What is my opinion? Yeah, I think they should be done now with rapid antigen testing. Weekly is possible. Earlier with RT-PCR, it was not possible, but with RAT, it is possible.
Thank you, ma'am. And one thing more, I just wanted to make another point regarding the relative infant dose, actually. So how feasible, actually, I have included this point in my scientific guidelines, but I want your opinion, how feasible this is to calculate relative infant dose in routine cases, ma'am?
What is it? Your voice is breaking. Lactating, prophylactic, lactating, this thing, what is that you want?
And the relative infant dose, actually, we have included this in our scientific statement, the relative infant dose. But
relative infant dose, the critical parent should be calculated in HCQ. I have no idea. I have no idea of about this HCQ prophylaxis.
Because I was going through the literature and there it is mentioned that RIA should be calculated, like the breast milk is taken as the substrate for concentration of that particular drug, and then the estimated volume is considered how much drug is ingested by the infant, like the amount of drug in the milk multiplied by the volume of milk which the infant is ingesting, and then the relative infant dose is calculated by a certain formula. And less than 10% is considered if the breast milk contains less than 10%. So actually, I have included this in my scientific guidelines. But
Okay.
your expert view also on this particular topic, ma'am.
Can I answer this question? Actually, in general, the breastfeeding is considered to be acceptable when the relative infant dose is less than 10%. And the additional considerations are required when the gestational or the postnatal age of the infant or actual milk being ingested, that is less in the first couple of the days than weaning. Then all these things has to be calculated. As you already mentioned, it is estimated as a drug concentration of the breast milk into the volume of the breast milk is ingested. So this is actually when the infant's size comes down, like a premature infants and everything, as a routine for them it is more applicable than to a normal persons. That's what my literature search says, that it is not a mandatory to each and every breastfeeding female we had to calculate this.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Can I add one point? This is Dr. Benzita. So, in our practice, in rheumatology practice, we never discontinue hydroxychloroquine in lactating women. It is continued in the same dose, 5 milligram per kg.
Okay,
it is considered safe in pregnancy and lactation. We have never discontinued it.
Okay.
Even the literature supports it.
Okay. ठीक है, ma'am.
Ma'am, even I have a point that the nursing people who are wearing PPE kits for long duration, there are no guidelines for how long they are supposed to wear. I inquired about their nursing council. From their nursing council also, they don't have enough guidelines. So for 8 hours, it is too long. Like Madam rightly said, even 2 hours is very difficult.
This is a practical issue which needs to be introduced for the safety of the healthcare professional. I don't think there will be any existing guidelines for this. This has to be the first and has to be introduced for the safety.
Yeah, I fully agree with you all.
Can I make a small statement here, Lalita? Am I allowed?
Yes,
Just
please.
a small on this. If you see, actually, while reading something like this, because we see it in our perioperative and ICU scenario where nurses are scrubbed for 4 hours, 5 hours, and we ourselves are there for 6 hours, the UN Women, there is a team called the UN Women, has strongly recommended to the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare to introduce the giving of sanitary pads and tampons with the PPE kits for anyone who's menstruating, and the PPE kit is being provided. It is becoming mandatory now. And secondly, the number of hours from 6 hours for all healthcare workers, at least in AIMS, has come down to 4 hours. So the whole duty shift is for 6 hours, but wearing of the PPE has been reduced by 2 hours, keeping in mind. Now, you're right that there is no nursing guideline. There is no guideline as such, even from the ministry or ICMR right now. But yes, if the UN has done it, and I know that the University of Brigham in UK has adopted it. So if these people are at it, I'm sure we'll soon have guidelines on the number of hours for PPE in menstruating women who are doing work as healthcare workers, wherever.
That's what I feel. Our scientific statement should become a foundation for the recommendations further.
Very true.
Yeah,
Very true.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ma'am. And we go to the next session on microbiology. I request Professor Lakshmi ma'am to be on the panel and Dr. Dipender Chinna to present it.
Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Dipender. What to learn from a microbiologist? So there is no gender-based significant difference in the positivity of coronavirus infection, but more severe disease has been reported in males by few studies. Early diagnosis and isolation of the infected patients. Nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal swabs are collected in BGM and they should be transported under cold chain. Blood samples are collected for antibody testing. Currently, there are 3 types of tests which are available. RT-PCR is the gold standard. It has to be done in BSL level 2 facility. 6 to 8 hours is the turnaround time and 94 samples can be tested in. Then antibody detection test is used for seroprevalence, for serosurveillance of the immune population. Testing, segregation, and preventive strategies like wearing adequate by reinforcing the hygiene habits in the family. Thank you.
Madam, there is a lot of disturbance from your side, I think. Hardly we are able to hear anything. Can we go to the research scientific statement and come back for the question? Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, can I request Dr. Somdata to talk about this research component?
Yeah, so I'm Somdata Karak. I represent CSIR's Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology, and I'm here to talk about some of the understanding of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and COVID infection from the basic research point of view. So the first point that I'll make is based on our studies at CCMB itself. We understand that the genome of the virus samples in India as well as globally, most of them fall under one category, which is called the Clade 2A. Now, this is good because if the genome of the virus is similar all across the world, more or less, then a singular virus management strategy can work for all of them. On the other hand, we have been talking a lot about the discrepancy between men and women getting differentially infected, or the outcomes being differential between the two genders. And then the genome of the virus does not seem to play a role in that. Then what does play a role here seems to be the molecular biology of the infection itself. So we know that the virus enters the lung epithelial cells through angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE2 receptors that we call. This ACE2 has been found to be expressed on lung cells as well as many other parts of the body as well, includes kidney, testes, gut, heart and brain as well. So, and this ACE2 has been shown to be expressed in higher amount in males, as well as it has been shown to be downregulated by estrogen. And the entry of the virus through ACE2 is also primed by a protease, which is called as TMPRSS. And TMPRSS is a gene that is regulated by androgens again. So there's also a gender differentiality in this aspect, and the best bets at the moment are that men get higher infection and they show worse outcomes because of higher levels of ACE2 in their body, as well as the higher expression of TMPRSS gene. In addition, women are also known to show higher immune responses thanks to estrogen, and testosterone is also known to do the exact opposite, that it diminishes immune responses. So, and at the same time, a lot of genes that are known to be required for immunity are expressed on X chromosome. And given that women have two copies of X chromosomes, it is believed that women are at an immune advantage, because if there's a mutation in one of these genes, women have the possibility of having another gene which is probably not deleterious. However, for males, they have only one option. So immune advantage in women is also expected to play a role in COVID, but there's no very strong established report yet which talks about the role of this differences in the immune reactions in both men and women.
We have Professor Radha on the panel. Madam, we would like to have comments from you.
And Dr. Sridevi also.
Yes, and Dr. Sridevi.
Most of the evidence we have with respect to gender bias based on the biological difference between men and women has experience of handling earlier infections. It's a little early to understand the biological differences in response to COVID-2 infection. And I think we have to wait for some more time before we can come up with more concrete evidence and explain why there are these differences.
There was some talk on, I mean, genetic variations and severity of disease. What are your comments on that, ma'am?
Exactly. That is probably because of differences in polymorphisms of genes involved in immune responses. If you're asking differences between women or differences between women. So either way, all immune response is dependent on the genetic makeup of the host and how each person is combating a particular kind of infection. So this is based on chromosomal localization of genes and their variants, which can be different between the men and women because the two X's can have a difference in effect on the whole body compared to what it is in men where there's only one X chromosome. And it is also known that genes on the sex chromosomes actually influence the expression of genes on the autosomes. So we have a long way to go before we can get a better understanding on what exactly is happening when there is a COVID-19 infection and the responses of each individual being variable, which is what it is all about. Why some people just get off without any kind of symptoms and why other people fall on the other side of the wall and then go into an extreme debility.
Thank you, ma'am. Lakshmi ma'am, we have you on the panel. Would you like to comment on this?
On the microbiological aspect, I can comment. Like now people are using rapid antigen left and right. Actually, antigen is not, the testing has to be taken. Most of the time, antigen positivity, okay, if it is positive, at least you know there is some problem there. But if it is negative, it doesn't ensure that the patient is not having COVID. So always antigen testing has to be followed by a PCR test, especially when it is negative. So that is the recommendation. But then everybody is using the antigen test as a rapid test and rapid screening test, and then doing, like, of course, just like HIV, this also has got some problems in antigen testing, and you have to use all your PPEs and everything, even if the antigen testing is negative. So ultimately, the rule is that your PPEs are the only one which can help you in preventing further transmission of the virus. And there was one question on saliva being the sample of choice. Yes, saliva, because the virus is within the mouth and the oral cavity, saliva is a very good sample, and it has been shown that the viral load is quite high in the saliva compared to the nasopharyngeal swabs. But then a lot of studies have to be done before you can really. I think ICMR has done a lot of studies, and it probably will be the sample of choice in the near future. Only thing is, with nasopharyngeal swab, the problem is the way it is collected, and if the sample is not properly collected, then it also gives you a false negative result. So that is one caution which I wanted to tell. The proper sampling is very much important in case of nasopharyngeal swab, because it is a very invasive procedure and little painful for the patients. So they may not cooperate properly. But if the saliva sample is going to be the next choice, then I think we should all be happy about it, that we are going to get a better result. And it lasts longer also. The result, the salivary viral loads up till 20 days of infection, they will be high. That is the
May I request Professor Deepender Madam, if she wants to say, that time with that lot of disturbance, we could not hear anything? Or anyone want to give any other comments?
I wanted to tell you about, of course, CCMB Madam has already said. Now, fortunately, as she said, the virus, previously they said there was a lot of mutations, but now, again, 2 days ago, they have given another statement saying that is the most stable, genome is very stable and there's not going to be any mutations. That is a good, happy note that we are probably the vaccine and whatever efforts are being done towards drugs also will be very effective in the near future. Because the virus is not so much mutating as people really thought.
Can I make a small point, Jyotsna, Lalita?
Yeah, please, madam, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to end that while we are all tackling the virus in the woman and how it attacks and affects the woman healthcare, it is important that we ourselves, just as you have made the effort to make the guidelines with a certain set of women, because we'll feel more sensitive about our own health and take care of it. And what we need from the administrators wherever we are working is for them to be sensitive to our needs, because our needs would be very different from the males and also that of the children. And as caregivers, not just in the hospital, but in our homes, in the society, now with most of the mothers, particularly the mothers, having to take care of the elders at home, having to take care of the children, and there is a home school going on, which is online. A woman is not just working 2 times more, she's working in COVID time 6 times more. And she too is so susceptible with equal risk and more burden. So what we need is for the administrators and we ourselves first to realize that we need very strong, powerful leadership to guide us and to put the women which are very sensitively attacked, because we may be protected right now because of the steroidal hormones on our X-linked genes. Fine. It's protecting us for some time, but it will not protect us always as the pandemic becomes worse, as we are dreading it in December, Jan. We are wanting that this peak may not happen, but suppose it does happen, we must gear up with very influential and strong leadership so that we can take care of our own problems at our own local levels, one in hand with all the seniors who are at their places of power. That's very essential for all of us to understand, that influential leadership for women healthcare in COVID pandemic is need of the hour.
That is the main intention of getting the scientific statements, ma'am. We need to get them into practice.
Yes.
That's the intention of Wincast to get on to the scientific statements.
Yeah.
Yes. Dr. Sridevi, do you want to say anything?
It was a very nice meeting, and congratulate all the.
Sridevi, ma'am, we would like to see you.
No, I only IIG comes. It's good. It was a very nice meeting. I was throughout the meeting, and I really appreciate all the efforts.
Actually, ma'am, this is very peculiar to this pandemic because usually whatever disease we discuss from a patient point of view, their management, clinical features. But I think no disease has affected the life of healthcare workers at this pandemic. So the much more focus is there on the healthcare workers, and that also on the female like healthcare workers who are devoted in fighting this pandemic. I think that is the peculiarity of this disease, and that is what has motivated us also to come forth and put our best foot forward. And also actually the most important thing is maintaining the balance between delivering our duties diligently and also taking care of the safety of ourselves and the staff who are associated and who are with us in fighting this disease. So that is the peculiarity of this pandemic.
Yes, ma'am. Accepted. As we came to the end of the program, I request Dr. Shiba for the final conclusion words.
I think, thank you so much, Dr. Lalita, for asking me to do that. You've done a great job, and I should appreciate the way you've conducted everything in great time. I think this is what we had planned. 9:30 and exactly minute to minute we have been there. Jyotsna ma'am also needs to come, Dr. Lalita. We can have her final words too. I think the purpose has begun. It is not, we will not call it as an end. I think we are to a new beginning. We have laid down these guidelines. Now we have to support it with more data and literature. What we have laid down in guidelines, we need to study in our daily clinical practice and come up with more literature and more data. So I am very greatly and immensely and deeply grateful to each and every member of the core committee, to our guiders who have been there with us throughout this journey. And let's call it a day today for a new beginning tomorrow. Let's all be in unison to work ahead on these lines and actually make a difference to society, which is very, very important. As women, we can do that, even if we are at our homes. So after you, Lalita, and it would be great to have everyone's comments. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Final remarks from Jyotsna ma'am before we end?
Last word of mine is thank you all.
Thanks to all. Thank you, Jignesh, for arranging this. Thanks to Sun Pharma for arranging this meet. Thanks to all the audience and the participants. Thanks a lot.